So we're back. We're going to see how far we get this time. Yesterday I did a bit of streaming and kind of got stuck on depth buffer, or the challenge part of that. I'm going to just sort of muddle my way through it in this one. So welcome back. Let's get started. So let's make sure that we can still rebuild. Always a good thing to check. Yep, good. Okay. So what we were doing was, we'll start our timer here, 30 minutes. So what I was doing, just following this tutorial to use the depth texture as a way of getting the rendering right by depth. See, I don't even know the right language to use here. Making sure that whenever we're rendering objects, we're not getting the ordering wrong by depth and the z-axis. So objects that are meant to be in front of other objects are rendered appropriately in front. And that was a per pixel implementation. Uses the fragment shader and this thing called a depth texture, which we created in our texture class here, struct. And the challenge was to render that, to have a look at what that depth texture looked like. So I haven't done any thinking about that overnight, but I guess we'll work it out. So join me as I fumble my way through. Okay, so don't think we'll need texture anywhere along here, but let's see. So we have our depth texture. Stored in our struct for the app. We do on resize, we create a new one. And then that is used in the render pass in this depth stencil attachment. What we worked out was load op clear 1 means clear the means don't store any state from the previous render pass from memory, and then store means we could write to it, I believe. So this generates during the render pass, that generates the texture, and it's used by the render pass down here from memory. No, we didn't have to do that. That's right. It was just binding it to the render pass here, or attaching it rather. Okay. Now, so we've got a texture, right? And so we know how to draw a texture, because we draw the texture on the polygon. So can we not just create a big quad, covers the whole screen, and render the entire texture there? Have no idea if that would even work. What I should read this. It's a texture, we can sample it. Because it's a depth texture, we have to use sampler comparison uniform type, if you say so. And the texture sample compare function instead of sampler and sampler 2D. Create a bind group for the depth texture and render it. Yep. Sampler comparison. the texture bind group layout has two entries. First is the texture and the second is the sampler. Let me make sure that before I screw up my program here, we've got everything committed. Yeah, good. Okay. So I wonder if we could just go and create another texture bind group layout. Oh, sorry, yeah, just maybe another entry here. Let's try. Let's just see how we go. So we could do another bind group layout entry. I mean, I honestly don't know if this is even makes sense, but this is trial and error. So visibility, shader stages. What does this do? Fragment. Yeah. So we only need the fragment shader. So this is the filter. Oh, sorry, sampler. Let's look at binding type. Sampler. Can be used to sample a texture. Okay. So I have a feeling we'll need the texture and a sampler. Is that right? Sampler comparison uniform type. How do we do this before? We did a sampler last time. So this seems to be stuff that would be in the shader. So we'll need another uniform. Sampler comparison uniform type. I think we're going to have to look into the shaders. Oh dear. Part of me wants to use ChatGPT, part of me wants to read the spec. Where's the W? Hang on, what's this one? Okay, I want the shader one, so WGSL W3C spec. Okay, how do I search this thing easily? Okay, it's all one big page. Sampler comparison. A depth texture is capable of being accessed in conjunction with a sampler comparison. It can also be accessed without the use of a sampler. All right. The textile format of the texture is defined in texture binding layout. Dimensionality, arrayed, depth 2D. A sampler mediates access to a sample texture or depth texture by performing a combination of coordinate transformation, blah, 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 determining the comparison function applied to the retrieved texel. Sure. Okay. Let's, so we don't need a sampler here. Do we need, so it's like we don't even need to, I was assuming I'd need a sampler, but it looks like we don't. So the depth texture is like special, which is kind of annoying. Create a bind group for the depth texture. Let's get rid of that. Let's do a bind group. I mean, we'll just take this instruction literally. So let depth bind group. Create bind group. And it needs a bind group descriptor. Who knows? And I don't know if we can use the same layout. Create a bind group for the depth texture. Depth texture? What did I call it? Depth texture. Depth bind group. So, who knows if this will work? So we've got a texture bind group up here. Where were they? Got these bind groups for our textures. And we've got a view and a sampler. It says we don't need a sampler. But because it's a depth texture, we'll have to use the sampler comparison uniform type and the texture sample compare function. Let's see what's in binding resource. Oh my god, where is my documentation? Binding resource. Sampler array. Binding resource. Texture view array, sampler. It says we don't need a sampler. Texture sample compare function. This is our camera uniform. Instance struct vertex shader. It's a sampler. So we need I never used sampler 2D. Sampler 2D. Sampler comparison. Group 1 binding 0. Close that. Uniform. The camera buffer. Bind group. Set bind group 1, camera bind group. Binding 0 in group 1. Position is 0. Group 0 binding. Zero and 1. Okay, so group 0 was, so this is all these bind groups, right? So that specifies the group. And in this case, we had the texture first and then the vertex buffer second. So texture first, vertex buffer second. But vertex buffer position text coordinates. Position tech coordinates. So the question is, so this is where my knowledge of bind groups is showing up, or just in general shaders. I'm a bit lost. So we know we need a sampler comparison uniform type and something to do with this as well. So we know we need the sampler. We need a sampler. So no sampler comparison. Comparison sampler. Built-in texture functions can only be used by the texture built-in functions. Parameterized when created in the WebGPU API. Yeah. And they do stuff like coordinate transformation, modifying MIP level selection, retrieving filtered texel values. And then otherwise determining the comparison function applied to the retrieved texel. Interesting. type is not a value. The depth texture is capable of being accessed in conjunction with this sampler comparison. It can be accessed without the use of a sampler. Only allows read accesses. Textual format. Do we have examples? No. I want some examples, people. Where's my example? So we've got an example of a sampler here. Let's see. Let's just keep going and see if we can keep building. Probably already broken stuff, I suspect. Well, I just created another bind group. Yeah. Okay. What did I do? Depth bind group, I think it was. Okay. So because it uses this group layout, we need 2 entries because the layout specifies 2 entries. Wherever the layout was, up here somewhere. So I need a sampler. But apparently I don't need a sampler. Okay, cool. Well, let's do it anyway. And that's defined in texture. Where are we? What does sampler return? Is it in here? Sampler is a sample descriptor that defines what we do when it runs off the edge and other stuff. Compare. That's fine. Looks like that should be the right thing. So that's when you create it from an image. So we create a completely different sampler. And what does that look like? Clamp to edge, linear, nearest. So it has a compare function. Well, let's create the same sampler. Depth bind. We need another entry here. That'll be the depth texture sampler. Okay, that might let us run now. Oh. Okay. Five minutes, we're not making much progress. Okay, we got a crash. Okay, cool. Texture binding expects sample type filterable true, but given a view with format blah. So it looks like this bind group layout's wrong. Do We need another bind group layout. Filterable true. Sampler binding type. Apparently we don't need a sampler. Okay, sampler binding type. We need a comparison one. Well, let's see how far the rabbit hole goes. So we'll do depth texture binding layout, bind group layout, create bind group layout descriptor. Stuff it. Let's just copy pasta. Okay, so we have a fragment shader, texture sample type, sampler binding type should be comparison, maybe. I have no idea, just guessing. Sample type. Binding type texture. So this is a layout entry for the fragment shader. I have a feeling we're going to have to use a different shader as well. It's going to get complicated. The issue is I don't really know why I'm doing this other than some hints in documentation. Anyway, let's have a look at texture sample type. Depth. Well, depth. I don't know. Let's just see. This is all broken. Great. Expected but found. Oh, need a layout. No. It's all broken now. What am I doing wrong here? Need a label, but that's not why it's failing. Some depth texture bind group layout. Bind group layout. Goodness me. Okay, so I think, I'm guessing, but I'm assuming that this will do something that is useful, because we'll have a texture sample of type depth. Who knows though? Is that accurate? We need another half now, don't we? I just feel like this is not right. So 2D. Because we still want to draw the depth texture. So I hope this doesn't mean like float, because it is a 32-bit float. Texture sample type defaulting to float indicates type for texture views bound. Yeah. I wish they'd given me some more information. Let's have a look. I'm writing some WGP code in Rust. Can you explain to me? Floating point data. So it is depth textures. Yeah. But we want to interpret the data in there as float and then render it. So I wonder if we use depth, whether or not that'll prevent us from viewing it. Is texture sample type depth correct here if we want to render the depth texture? Anyway, do we run? Oh, and then we need to change the bind group layout in our depth texture bind group. Was it depth bind group? So here we've got different layout here. Okay, now do we run? Probably not. I'll be surprised if this works. All right. Okay, so we're now back to where we started. Okay. So we have a depth bind group that connects to the depth texture with a comparison sampler. We've got this new bind group layout, which is up here. Let's get shadow maps. Okay. What about this thing? The type of sampler used in the fragment shader. Sampler texture and compare the results to a reference value. Okay. So that means what? How do we get the reference value? Sampler comparison. Okay. So So now shader. This doesn't look. What are these double brackets? That's not how any of this other stuff works. Anyway, let's try. So we need a different shader though. This is annoying. So at the moment, the fragment shader just basically gets the coordinates out of the texture and draws them, or it just returns that, whatever texture sample is. Like, what the F? What is texture sample? It's helpful. I want invalid, I want real samples of texture. Well, that's helpful. I see it's like another language to me, which is quite cool. I don't know what uniformity analysis. I guess I have no idea. Anyway, diffuse, sampler diffuse, and the coordinates. Vec2 sampler. But here we're not doing that. Texture sample compare. So that's what it does. It says if it's less than 1. The comparison field in binding type is set to true. Texture is created with a format suitable for depth data. The compare field, the sampler descriptor is set to a comparison function. Yeah, no shit, Sherlock. This is very slow going. So I'm just seeing if I can use the same shader or not. Because I'd really rather not have to have a separate one. The question is, can I do both? Like, I don't want to... can I return both pixels? No, probably not. I don't know how that would work. Like, I don't even know what a depth map looks like. What is a depth? What does a depth texture look like? Cool. Like, I really don't want to have to create a whole new shader for this thing, because it'd be basically the same thing, but just replacing this. So we've got a depth bind group. Bind group. Yep. Why is it so hard to find the right docs? We don't need winit. Okay. Bind group layout. Pipeline layout. Available binding groups. So what if I just do this? Depth bind group camera. Do I need a bind group? Oh, this is a terrible song. So we've got this, right, depth texture 2D, and the sampler. So it's a different type of sampler. That's the difference. So basically it's like this. This is going to break everything, but let's just go with this for a second. So sampler comparison. And then this returns actually, let's try not to break anything yet. Let's do is in shadow. I mean, I actually want to return a texture. Not texture sample compare. We actually want the sampler to do the comparison, right? Do we? Or do we? Okay, apparently we do. Texture sample compare. We still want to return a vec4 though. Because what we're going to need to do is something like if texture sample compare but what are we comparing? So what are we doing? We've got like, why do we need that? We've basically, don't we already have a texture and we just want to write it out? So like, aren't we just getting, so T diffuse is like a texture diffuse, sampler diffuse. What is texture sample? A 2D array. What is the sampler? What does texture sample do in WGSL? Hello. Okay. Sample a color value from a texture. This function performs a texture lookup using the provided texture coordinates. And applies a sampling method. Texture sampler chords. So we'll have the same thing. We'll have a texture to sample from, which is the depth texture. The sampler will be some comparison thing. And then chords. Yeah. I like this better. It's more explicit. And in this case, like we'll basically have values from 0 to 1. But why do we need to compare? I still don't understand. Because I don't know what's in the depth texture, but I believe it's just pixels. It's basically just a floating point for every pixel that is normalized between 0 to 1 that represents the distance from the camera. And so I thought we'd just need to be able to scale it up to 255, proportionally between 0 to 255. So you literally times by 255, set RGB to be the same channels. So it'd literally be something like it'll literally be something like this, right? It'd be let's just call it value equals texture sample T diffuse, the sampler okay, and then that's not right either. How do we get the... do I create a vec4? Vec4. Can I create a literal like this? This is probably wrong, but this is sort of what I'm trying to do. Value of 2 times by 255. And then 1. It's like that. And then return something like this. So, because what I want to do is sample the depth texture, then unnormalize, get values from 0 to 255 with alpha of 1. Something like this. I mean, let's see how badly this breaks, because we're still returning a vec4, presumably, but we're not using the right sampler apparently, according to the tutorial. What is sampler 2D anyway? I'm not even using that. Who knows? Okay. Create a bind group for the depth texture, which we've done, but we're not sending it anywhere yet. Depth bind group. So we're not using the bind group anywhere. Okay, so here we had bind groups. Tree bind group, Glenda bind group. Well, let's see if we run. Surely it's going to break. Okay, cool. Excellent. It broke in an interesting way, at least. So for our render pipeline layout, render pipeline layout, what we want here, let's just see if we can break this. So depth bind group layout. This should now break. Jesus, so slow. Come on. Come on. Great. Bind group at index 2. These error messages are really interesting. So render pipeline, pipeline descriptor, render pipeline layout, vertex fragment, depth, so many concepts to keep in the head at one time. So we've got a render pipeline layout that defines the bind group layouts, and this would be the way that you would attach the texture bind group, I believe, to the render pipeline. When you get into the render pipeline, you specify the pipeline layout, which is this thing. Then you specify vertex, fragment, and depth. And so I don't see why that causes a problem. Hang on, should be incompatible bind group at index 2. Depth texture bind group layout. So camera, and let's look at camera and texture bind group layout. Okay. So this was available to vertex. Bind group layout. Let's look at all of them. I should have them all defined close to each other so I can compare them easily. Texture bind group layout. So texture, oh, that was depth. Okay, cool. So here we had I have a feeling that yeah, I don't know. Render pipeline. So we've got render pipeline descriptor. So, and inside of a pipeline descriptor, you've got the layout, vertex, fragment. I don't want to create a separate render pipeline, do I? Trying to avoid that. Maybe we need one. That'd be a pain. Depth render. Oh my god. I wonder. Render pass. I have a feeling I'm going to have to fork all of this stuff, which just feels like a nightmare to me. All right, I'm going to take a bit of a break here, folks. I'll be back in probably 5:10, probably 5 minutes. See you soon. Okay, we're back. Um, I'm I'm gonna call it here. So it's been a bit over an hour on this stream. I really need to do longer streams, so I'll have to work out a way of doing kind of 4 hour streams to kind of get this stuff done. I'm fairly sure that my approach here is wrong. Um, like it. So I'm setting up a whole separate kind of render pass, if you like, for rendering the depth texture. And I don't think I can reuse the existing render pass configuration. For example, I don't need, like, to render the depth texture buffer, I don't need like a depth stencil attachment because I'm not rendering any geometry that I'm aware of, right? Like that I can understand. Like I think I'm just rendering pixels, drawing pixels to I don't know. So anyway, I feel like I'm gonna have to set up maybe a whole new render pass. Certainly, I think a whole new render pipeline. Maybe. I think because I don't think I need any of this stuff. Yeah. So that's going to be quite entertaining. So anyway, I'll need to do a bit more reading and thinking. But hey, we'll leave it where it is. I think I'm breaking now, so I might just get rid of the bind group layout change that I just did. Where was that? It was in the render. Oop, there it was. Ah, God, render. It was here. So I might just comment this out. See if we can still run. Oh, and I'll get rid of this again. Let's see what happens here. Okay, let's see if I can, so I'm just updating the code here. Okay, so we're back to where we were. So I'm just returning value, which is basically what this thing was doing anyway, and I've just removed the depth texture bind group layout from the render pipeline layout, and I think I'm gonna have to fork this whole thing. Just feels like a lot of verbose code. Anyway, so should I commit? I guess so. Why not? Git add source lib and shader, and trying to render the depth texture and not even close yet. Emojis. Excellent. All right. So anyway, folks, we'll come back to this, and we'll try and finish this piece in the next stream. Look, I'm just trying out these streams to see if they're of interest to anyone. Certainly, they're interesting to me. Helps me think through the problem, and if I can get a little bit of rigor around the schedule, that will hopefully mean that I'm able to make a bit more progress and make more progress on stream. You can see I'm still learning. There's so much in this stuff. Like there's so many concepts to keep in your head just in WebGPU, let alone the shader stuff, let alone the way that this stuff all fits together architecturally from a software design point of view. There's a lot, but that's the stuff that I love to do. So anyway, thanks. Leave a comment if you want to make any constructive comments or give me some feedback, and hit me up with a like, and then I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.